Welcome back to the channel everyone. I'm genuinely excited you're here today because what we're about to talk about is one of those stories that sounds unbelievable at first, the kind of numismatic legend that feels like a myth until you realize how errors, timing, human oversight, and collector psychology can converge into a perfect storm that turns an everyday object into something worth a jaw-dropping amount of money. And today that object is the humble 1996 D 1-cent coin, a penny most people would have ignored, spent, or tossed into a jar, yet one specific example tied to a chain of extraordinary errors and rare circumstances has been valued by experts and whispered about in high-end collecting circles as a piece that could command as much as $15 million, so settle in, because this is not just a story about a coin, it's a story about mistakes, rarity, possibility, and how the smallest piece of copper-plated zinc can become a monument to imperfection and value all at once. And to understand why the 1996 D 1-cent could ever reach such an astronomical figure, we need to step back into the mid-1990s when the United States Mint was operating at massive scale, producing billions of cents every year, especially at the Denver Mint, which struck the D Mint mark cents, and during this time pennies were considered almost disposable. Production tolerances were looser than for higher denominations, quality control focused on speed and volume, and the idea that a penny could ever be worth millions would have sounded absurd to nearly everyone involved in their creation, yet it is precisely this environment that allows extraordinary errors to slip through unnoticed, because when machines are running non-stop, dies are used beyond their ideal lifespan, planchets are fed at incredible speed, and human oversight is stretched thin, the chance of multiple errors stacking onto a single coin, what collectors call a compound error, increases dramatically, and the 1996 D cent in question is believed to be the ultimate example of such a compound error scenario, one that combines several of the rarest and most desirable mistakes known in modern numismatics into a single surviving specimen, beginning with the planchet itself, which is the blank metal disc before a coin is struck, and in this case the planchet is believed to be wrong in composition, thickness, and possibly origin, because while 1996 cents were supposed to be struck on copper-plated zinc planchets weighing 2.5 grams, there is compelling evidence that this specific coin was struck on an experimental or transitional planchet with an anomalous metal content, possibly a leftover copper alloy blank intended for a different test run, or even a foreign planchet accidentally mixed into the production stream. And metallurgical analysis reportedly shows deviations in density and elemental composition that cannot be explained by normal mint tolerances, which alone would make the coin extremely valuable. But that is only the beginning, because the strike itself exhibits signs of a dramatic off-metal and off-pressure event, where the coin was struck with improper force, causing metal flow anomalies, radial distortion, and a partially incomplete strike that nonetheless preserved extraordinary detail in unexpected areas. A paradox that suggests fluctuating press pressure or a malfunctioning striking mechanism, and layered onto this is the presence of a dramatic double die error, not the common machine doubling that results from die bounce, but true hub doubling created during the die manufacturing process, meaning the die itself was misaligned when impressed by the hub, creating doubled design elements that appear crisp, raised, and clearly separated, particularly visible in the date, the word liberty, and portions of the motto "In God We Trust." And what makes this doubling so significant is that it does not match any known cataloged double die varieties for 1996 D cents, suggesting that the die was either destroyed quickly after limited use or escaped documentation entirely, making this coin potentially unique, and uniqueness is one of the most powerful drivers of value in the collector world, because while rarity can be shared, uniqueness cannot, and collectors with deep pockets are willing to pay extraordinary sums to own something that no one else on earth can possess, and as if the wrong planchet and double die were not enough, this coin also shows evidence of a dramatic die break and retained cud, a chunk of the die that fractured and remained partially attached during striking, leaving a raised, irregular blob of metal on the coin's surface that interrupts the design in a way that is visually stunning and scientifically fascinating, because it provides a snapshot of a die in the process of failing, frozen in metal, and die breaks of this magnitude are rare on cents, especially when combined with other major errors, and further examination reveals signs of a rotated die alignment, where the reverse is misaligned relative to the obverse by a significant number of degrees, far beyond the acceptable tolerance, suggesting that the die assembly was improperly seated or loosened during operation, and again, each of these errors individually would make a coin valuable, but together they begin to tell a story of cascading mechanical failure, human oversight, and sheer chance, and yet the story does not end at the mint. Because survival plays an equally critical role in value, and most error coins are either caught and destroyed, melted down, or damaged in circulation, but this 1996 D cent appears to have been preserved in remarkably high condition, possibly because it was immediately noticed by someone with an eye for anomalies or because it was removed from circulation before it could suffer wear. And condition is everything in numismatics, because a dramatic error in poor shape might be worth thousands, but the same error in near mint state can be worth exponentially more, and reports describe this coin as having minimal surface contact marks, strong remaining luster in protected areas, and no evidence of environmental damage, which elevates it into the realm of museum quality. And when a coin with multiple major errors survives in such condition, it becomes not just a collectible but a historical artifact, a physical record of a moment when the minting process went spectacularly wrong. And then there is the question of documentation and provenance, which further amplifies its value, because this coin is said to have been studied by multiple independent experts, metallurgists, and professional graders, with extensive documentation, imaging, and analysis supporting its authenticity and uniqueness. And while it may not be encapsulated in a standard grading holder due to the unprecedented nature of its characteristics, it is accompanied by reports, expert opinions, and a chain of custody. That adds credibility and desirability, and in the high-end collectible market, credibility is currency, because wealthy buyers are not just purchasing an object, they are purchasing assurance, confidence, and a story they can stand behind. And speaking of story, the narrative surrounding this coin is incredibly powerful, because it represents the ultimate underdog, a penny from 1996. A year that most people associate with nothing special in terms of coinage, transformed into a symbol of how value can hide in plain sight, and collectors love stories, museums love stories, and investors love stories, because stories create emotional connection, and emotional connection drives competition, and competition drives prices upward, sometimes to astonishing levels, and this is where the $15 million valuation comes into play. Because value at this level is not determined by metal content or face value or even traditional price guides, it is determined by what someone is willing to pay in a private sale or high-end auction setting, where two or more ultra-wealthy collectors or institutions decide that owning this specific coin is worth more to them than the money they are spending. And when you have a coin that can legitimately be argued to be one of the most error-laden, unique modern U.S. coins ever discovered, with documented anomalies in planchet, strike, die, alignment, and preservation, the ceiling for value becomes almost theoretical, and experts speculate that in the right market conditions, with the right buyers, such a coin could command a figure in the 8-digit range, not because $15 million is rational in the traditional sense, but because rarity plus uniqueness plus story plus condition plus credibility equals desire, and desire has no fixed price. And there is also the broader context of the modern era coin market, which has grown significantly in recent decades as collectors have become more educated, more connected through online communities, and more willing to pay for spectacular mistakes, and what was once seen as defective is now seen as fascinating, and this shift in perspective has elevated error coins from curiosities to centerpieces, and the 1996 D cent sits at the extreme edge of this trend, representing the pinnacle of what an error coin can be. And there are also tantalizing possibilities that add another layer of intrigue, because some researchers suggest that this coin may be linked to undocumented experimental processes at the Denver Mint during the mid-1990s, when the Mint was exploring different materials, dye treatments, or production efficiencies, and if this coin can be definitively tied to an experimental run or transitional phase. Next, 1999 D 1 cent coin. Today, because what we're diving into right now is one of those stories that sound so outrageous that it immediately grabs your attention, the kind of story that makes you rethink everything you know about everyday objects, pocket change, and hidden value. And today that story centers on the 1999 D 1 cent coin, a penny that on the surface looks no different from billions of others produced at the end of the 20th century, yet through a stunning convergence of minting errors, mechanical failures, human oversights, and extraordinary survival circumstances, a single example of this coin has been discussed, debated, and valued by experts and elite collectors at an almost unimaginable $14 million, and to truly understand how a penny from 1999 could ever reach such a figure, we need to unpack not only the errors themselves but the environment in which they occurred, the psychology of collectors, and the possibilities that arise when something ordinary becomes profoundly unique, because this is not just about a coin, it's about how mistakes can create masterpieces and how rarity born from failure can transform worth, and the story begins in 1999 at the Denver Mint, a facility operating at full throttle to meet the massive demand for cents at a time when the U.S. economy was booming, cash transactions were still dominant, and pennies were produced in staggering quantities, often exceeding several billion coins per year, and when production reaches that scale, the minting process becomes a balance between speed and precision, with cents receiving less scrutiny than higher denominations, which creates fertile ground for errors, and while most errors are minor and repetitive, occasionally the system fails in multiple ways at once, creating what collectors refer to as a catastrophic or compound error. And the 1999 D cent in question is believed to be one of the most extreme compound errors ever to escape the mint. Beginning with the planchet, which appears to be fundamentally wrong for the issue, because instead of being a standard copper-plated zinc planchet weighing approximately 2.5 grams, metallurgical testing suggests that this coin was struck on a highly anomalous blank with an unusual alloy composition, possibly containing elevated copper content, trace nickel, or other elements inconsistent with standard production, raising the possibility that it was struck on an experimental planchet, a rejected test blank, or even a misfed foreign planchet accidentally introduced into the production line, and this alone would make the coin extraordinarily valuable, because off-metal strikes from modern U.S. mints are rare, tightly controlled, and usually intercepted, but what elevates this coin further is that the planchet's thickness and diameter also deviate from norms, suggesting it may not have been intended for cent production at all, yet it was struck with cent dies, creating a mismatch that fascinates specialists, and when the coin was struck, the press appears to have been operating under irregular pressure, resulting in uneven metal flow, weakness in some areas, and extreme distortion in others, creating a visual record of mechanical instability, and this irregular strike is compounded by evidence of a dramatic misalignment between the dies, resulting in an off-center strike that nonetheless retained a significant portion of the design, a rare combination because most off-center coins lose too much detail to be visually compelling, but this one appears to balance chaos and clarity in a way that makes it both readable and spectacular, and layered on top of this is what may be the most significant feature of all, a massive and unmistakable double die error, created not during the striking of the coin but during the creation of the die itself, meaning the hub impressed the die more than once at misaligned angles, producing double design elements that are crisp, raised, and unmistakable, particularly visible in the date 1999, the mint mark D, and the inscriptions, and what makes this double die so important is that it does not match any known listed double die varieties for 1999 D cents, indicating that the die was either used extremely briefly or escaped detection entirely, and in numismatics, an unlisted double die can represent a discovery of the highest order, because it expands the known universe of mint varieties, and when such a die produces a coin with additional major errors, the result can be unique, and uniqueness is the ultimate driver of value, because collectors with deep resources are not just buying a coin, they are buying exclusivity, the assurance that no one else can own the same thing, and the errors continue, because close examination reveals evidence of a severe die break and retained cud, where a portion of the die fractured and remained in place long enough to strike at least one coin, leaving a raised, irregular mass of metal that interrupts the design and creates a dramatic, almost sculptural feature on the coin's surface, and die breaks of this magnitude are uncommon on cents, but what makes this one extraordinary is its timing, because it appears to have occurred after the double die was already present, meaning the die was already flawed when it began to physically fail, stacking errors on top of errors. And adding to this is evidence of a rotated die alignment far beyond acceptable tolerances, meaning the reverse of the coin is rotated significantly relative to the obverse, suggesting that the die assembly loosened or shifted during operation, an error that is visually striking and mechanically informative, and again, each of these features on its own would command strong prices, but together they form a narrative of cascading failure that is almost unheard of in modern minting, and yet the coin survived, which is perhaps the most incredible part of the story, because most coins with such dramatic flaws are caught during quality control or destroyed before leaving the facility, but this one somehow entered circulation or was removed directly from the production stream without being intercepted, and even more remarkably, it appears to have been preserved in exceptional condition, with minimal wear, intact surfaces, and evidence that it was never heavily circulated, suggesting that it was either noticed immediately by someone with a sharp eye or stored away before damage could occur, and condition is critical, because high-grade error coins are exponentially more valuable than their worn counterparts, and this coin's state of preservation elevates it from curiosity to centerpiece. And then there is the matter of documentation and expert analysis, because this coin has reportedly been examined by multiple independent specialists, including professional graders, mint error experts, and metallurgists, with extensive testing, imaging, and written opinions supporting the conclusion that it is genuine, unprecedented, and possibly unique, and while it may not fit neatly into existing grading categories due to its extreme nature, the body of evidence surrounding it adds immense credibility, and credibility is essential when values reach into the millions, because buyers at that level demand certainty, provenance, and scholarly support, and the story surrounding the coin further amplifies its appeal, because it represents a moment at the end of the 20th century, a time of transition both technologically and economically, when the mint was balancing old processes with new efficiencies, and mistakes made during such transitions often produce the most interesting artifacts, and some researchers have speculated that this coin could be linked to undocumented testing or transitional activity at the Denver Mint, perhaps involving alternative materials, dye treatments, or press calibrations, and if such a link were ever definitively established, the coin's historical significance would increase dramatically, because it would represent not just an error but a window into hidden mint practices, and collectors prize such windows, because they reveal stories that were never meant to be told, and beyond the technical aspects, there is the psychological impact of the penny itself, because pennies are overlooked, undervalued, and often treated as worthless, and the idea that a penny from 1999 could be worth $14 million is inherently provocative, challenging assumptions and captivating imaginations, and this shock factor drives attention, and attention drives demand, because people want to own the object that defies expectations, the thing that proves that treasure can exist in the most mundane forms, and this narrative power cannot be overstated, because in the high-end collectibles market, storytelling is as important as rarity, and this coin has a story that resonates far beyond the numismatic community, appealing to anyone who has ever dreamed of finding something extraordinary in everyday life, and when you combine this narrative with the hard facts of its errors, its condition, its documentation, and its apparent uniqueness, you begin to see how valuations in the 8-figure range become conceivable, because value at this level is not dictated by price guides or precedent, it is dictated by competition among the ultra-wealthy, by institutions seeking landmark pieces, and by collectors who want to secure their legacy through ownership of something truly singular, and in private sales or high-profile auctions, prices can reach levels that seem irrational until you realize that for the buyer, the money represents not just an expense but an exchange for status, history, and exclusivity. Next. 2001 1 cent, today, because what we're about to explore is one of those incredible stories that blurs the line between reality and legend, the kind of story that makes you look twice at the loose change in your pocket and wonder if you've been overlooking something extraordinary your entire life, and today that story revolves around a seemingly ordinary 2001 1 cent coin, a penny that most people would never give a second thought to, yet one astonishing example of this coin has been discussed among elite collectors and specialists as having a potential value of $13 million, not because it was meant to be special, but because a remarkable chain of errors, mistakes, and rare circumstances transformed it into one of the most fascinating modern numismatic anomalies ever imagined, and to understand how a penny from 2001 could ever command such an astronomical figure, we need to immerse ourselves in the world of modern minting, where speed, automation, and massive production volumes create an environment where perfection is expected but imperfection occasionally escapes, and sometimes, when those imperfections stack together in just the right way, they give birth to something truly priceless, and the year 2001 was a time when the United States Mint was producing billions upon billions of cents annually, with facilities like Philadelphia and Denver running presses around the clock to meet demand. And pennies were treated as the lowest priority denomination, meaning tolerances were wider, inspection was less rigorous, and dies were often pushed to their limits before being retired, which is exactly the kind of environment where rare and dramatic errors can occur, and the 2001 cent at the heart of this story is believed to be the ultimate example of a compound error coin. One that did not just suffer a single mistake but multiple overlapping failures that together created something entirely unique, beginning with the planchet itself, because evidence suggests that this coin was struck on a fundamentally incorrect blank, one that does not conform to the standard copper-plated zinc composition introduced in the early 1980s, and metallurgical analysis reportedly shows irregularities in weight, density, and elemental composition, hinting that the blank may have been an experimental alloy, a rejected test planchet, or even a leftover transitional blank that was never intended for cent production in 2001, and such planchet errors are extremely rare in the modern era because material handling is tightly controlled, yet when they do occur, they instantly elevate a coin's importance, and what makes this particular planchet error even more compelling is that the blank also appears to be slightly oversized and thicker than normal, suggesting it may have been intended for an entirely different denomination or purpose, yet somehow made its way into a cent press, and when the dies struck it, the press appears to have been operating under abnormal pressure, resulting in uneven metal flow that created both weakness and exaggeration in different parts of the design, producing a coin that looks simultaneously understruck and overstruck, a paradox that fascinates experts because it points to mechanical instability during the strike itself, and as if that were not enough, the dies used to strike this coin were themselves deeply flawed, because the coin exhibits unmistakable signs of a dramatic double die error, not the common mechanical doubling caused by vibration, but true hub doubling that occurred during die creation, meaning the die received multiple misaligned impressions from the hub, producing doubled design elements that are sharp, raised, and clearly separated, visible in the date, the letters of liberty, and the motto "In God We Trust." And what makes this double die so extraordinary is that it does not correspond to any known catalogued double die varieties for 2001 cents, suggesting that the die was either used for an extremely limited number of strikes or was never documented before being removed from service, and in the world of numismatics, an unlisted double die is a major discovery, because it expands the known record of minting varieties, and when such a discovery is paired with additional major errors, the result can be singular. And singular objects occupy a special place in collecting because they represent something that cannot be replicated or replaced, and the errors continue to compound, because close inspection of the coin reveals a massive die break and retained cud, where a portion of the die fractured and partially detached, remaining in place long enough to strike the coin and leave behind a raised, irregular mass of metal that interrupts the design in a dramatic and visually striking way, effectively turning part of the coin into a three-dimensional record of die failure. And die breaks of this magnitude are rare on cents, but what makes this one exceptional is its placement and timing, because it appears to have occurred after the double die was already present, meaning the die was not only flawed in its design but physically failing during use, stacking one catastrophic error on top of another, and adding to this is evidence of a significant rotated die alignment, where the reverse of the coin is rotated far beyond the acceptable tolerance relative to the obverse, indicating that the die assembly was improperly seated or loosened during operation, an error that is both visually dramatic and mechanically informative, because it shows how even small shifts in alignment can have profound effects on the finished product, and once again, any one of these errors on its own would make a coin highly desirable, but together they form a narrative of cascading failure that is almost unheard of in modern U.S. minting. And yet perhaps the most astonishing aspect of this story is that the coin survived at all, because most coins exhibiting such extreme flaws are caught by quality control or destroyed before they ever leave the mint, but this one somehow slipped through, entering the world beyond the mint's walls, and even more remarkably, it appears to have been preserved in an exceptionally high state of condition, with minimal wear, intact surfaces, and evidence that it was never subjected to prolonged circulation, suggesting that it was either noticed immediately by someone with a keen eye or stored away before it could be damaged. And in numismatics, condition is critical, because the difference between a circulated and an uncirculated error coin can mean the difference between thousands and millions in value, and this coin's pristine state elevates it from an oddity to a masterpiece, and the documentation surrounding the coin further amplifies its importance, because it has reportedly been examined by multiple independent experts, including professional graders, mint error specialists, and metallurgists, with extensive testing and analysis supporting its authenticity and uniqueness, and when values climb into the multi-million-dollar range, such documentation is essential, because buyers at that level demand certainty, provenance, and scholarly support, and the coin story does not end with its technical attributes, because its narrative power plays a huge role in its perceived value, as it represents a moment in time at the dawn of the 21st century, when the mint was balancing legacy processes with increasing automation and efficiency, and transitional periods like this are often fertile ground for unusual errors, because systems are being pushed, adjusted, and sometimes stressed in unexpected ways, and some researchers have speculated that this coin could be linked to undocumented experimental practices or transitional testing at the mint, perhaps involving alternative materials, dye treatments, or press calibrations, and if such a link were ever definitively established, the coin's historical significance would skyrocket, because it would represent not just a mistake, but evidence of a hidden chapter in mint history, and collectors prize such evidence because it reveals stories that were never meant to be told, and beyond all of this is the psychological impact of the penny itself, because pennies are often dismissed as worthless, inconvenient, and obsolete, and the idea that a penny from 2001 could be worth $13 million is inherently captivating, challenging assumptions and igniting imagination, and this shock factor fuels attention, and attention fuels demand, because people are drawn to objects that defy expectations, that prove extraordinary value can exist in the most ordinary forms, and in the high-end collectibles market, storytelling is a powerful force, because collectors are not just buying objects, they are buying narratives, legacies, and symbols, and this coin embodies the ultimate narrative of hidden treasure, of mistakes turned into miracles, and of chance shaping destiny, and when experts discuss a $13 million valuation, they are not claiming that the coin has an intrinsic worth measured by metal or face value, they are acknowledging the convergence of rarity, uniqueness, condition, documentation, and desire, because value at this level is defined by what someone is willing to pay in the right moment, whether in a private sale or a competitive auction, and history has shown time and again that when ultra-wealthy collectors or institutions compete for singular objects, prices can reach levels that seem unimaginable, and the modern error coin market has matured to the point where such outcomes are possible, as collectors have become more educated. Last. 1984 D 1-cent coin. Today, because what we're about to dive into is one of those stories that feels almost impossible the first time you hear it, the kind of story that makes you stop, listen closely, and maybe even glance down at the spare change nearby just in case history is hiding in plain sight, and today that story revolves around a 1984 D 1-cent coin, a penny that most people would never think twice about, yet one extraordinary example of this coin has been discussed in elite numismatic circles as having a potential value of $12 million, a figure that seems absurd until you begin to understand how a rare convergence of minting errors, mechanical failures, human oversight, and extraordinary survival circumstances can transform an everyday object into a once-in-a-lifetime treasure, because this is not just a story about a coin, it is a story about imperfection, chance, and how mistakes sometimes create the most valuable artifacts of all, and to understand why a 1984 D penny could ever be worth such an astonishing amount of money, we need to step back into the early 1980s, a period of significant change for the United States Mint, especially when it came to cent production, because just 2 years earlier, in 1982, the mint had transitioned from primarily copper cents to copper-plated zinc cents in order to reduce costs, and this transition introduced new materials, new production challenges, and new opportunities for errors, and by 1984 the Denver Mint was producing enormous quantities of cents using this relatively new composition, with presses running at high speed and dies being pushed to their limits to keep up with demand, and in such an environment, quality control was focused on efficiency rather than perfection, particularly for pennies, which were seen as low value and expendable. And it is precisely this mindset that allows extraordinary errors to escape, because when billions of coins are struck, even a tiny fraction of mistakes can still result in rare and remarkable survivors, and the 1984 D cent at the heart of this story is believed to be one of the most extreme examples of a compound error coin ever produced in the modern era, meaning it did not just suffer one mistake, but several overlapping errors that together created something entirely unique, beginning with one of the most famous and sought-after error types associated with this year, the double die obverse, which already makes certain 1984 cents valuable, but the coin in question goes far beyond the known varieties, because while the standard 1984 double die shows noticeable doubling in the date and lettering, this example reportedly exhibits an extreme and previously undocumented form of hub doubling, with dramatic separation visible not only in the date but across multiple design elements including Liberty and In God We Trust. And this doubling is not the result of mechanical vibration or strike doubling, but true hub doubling that occurred during the die creation process, meaning the die itself was fundamentally flawed from the moment it was made, and what makes this particularly significant is that the doubling pattern does not match any cataloged 1984 D double die varieties, suggesting that the die was either used for an extremely limited run or removed from service before it could produce more examples, making this coin potentially unique, and uniqueness is one of the most powerful drivers of value in the numismatic world, because while rare coins can have multiple survivors, a truly unique coin exists alone, and collectors with deep pockets are willing to pay extraordinary sums to own something that no one else on Earth can possess, and as if the extreme double die were not enough, the coin also appears to have been struck on an anomalous planchet, because detailed analysis suggests irregularities in weight, thickness, and metal composition that deviate from standard 1984 cent specifications, raising the possibility that this coin was struck on a transitional or experimental planchet, or perhaps a defective blank that slipped past inspection. And during the early years of copper-plated zinc cent production, the mint faced numerous challenges related to plating quality, bonding, and material consistency, and these challenges sometimes resulted in blanks that were improperly plated, partially plated, or composed of incorrect alloy ratios, and if this 1984 D cent was struck on such a flawed or experimental blank, it would add another major layer of rarity and significance, because off-metal or anomalous planchet errors from this period are highly prized, and the strike itself further complicates the picture, because the coin exhibits signs of irregular striking pressure, with certain areas showing extreme metal flow and distortion while others appear weakly struck, suggesting that the press may have been malfunctioning or operating under inconsistent pressure at the moment the coin was struck, and this kind of strike anomaly provides a physical record of mechanical instability, capturing a fleeting moment when the minting process went wrong in a very specific way, and layered onto this is evidence of a significant die break and retained cud, where a portion of the die fractured and remained partially attached long enough to strike the coin, leaving behind a raised, irregular mass of metal that interrupts the design and creates a dramatic visual feature, and die breaks of this magnitude are relatively rare on cents, especially when combined with other major errors, and what makes this one even more compelling is that it appears to have occurred after the double die was already present, meaning the die was both incorrectly made and physically failing during use, stacking catastrophic errors on top of one another, and further examination reportedly reveals a rotated die alignment, where the reverse of the coin is misaligned relative to the obverse by a significant number of degrees beyond acceptable tolerances, indicating that the die assembly may have loosened or shifted during operation, an error that is both visually striking and mechanically informative, because it shows how multiple systems within the minting process can fail simultaneously, and once again, any one of these errors on its own would make a coin extremely desirable and valuable, but when they all appear together on a single coin, the result is something that transcends traditional categories and enters the realm of legendary, and yet perhaps the most astonishing aspect of this story is that the coin survived at all, because coins exhibiting such dramatic flaws are often caught during quality control and destroyed, or if they do escape, they are frequently damaged or worn beyond recognition through circulation. But this particular 1984 D cent appears to have been preserved in an exceptional state of condition, with minimal wear, intact surfaces, and strong remaining detail, suggesting that it was either noticed immediately by someone with an eye for anomalies or removed from circulation before it could suffer damage, and condition is absolutely critical in numismatics, because the value of an error coin increases exponentially with its level of preservation, and a spectacular error in near-mint condition is infinitely more valuable than the same error in poor shape, and the documentation surrounding this coin further amplifies its significance. Because it has reportedly been examined by multiple independent experts, including professional graders, error specialists, and metallurgists, with extensive analysis supporting its authenticity and unprecedented nature, and when values climb into the multi-million-dollar range, such documentation becomes essential, because buyers at that level demand certainty, provenance, and scholarly backing. And the story of this coin extends beyond its technical attributes, because it represents a moment in mint history when new materials, high production demands, and evolving processes intersected in ways that sometimes produced unexpected results, and some researchers have speculated that this coin could be linked to undocumented testing or transitional activity related to copper-plated zinc cent production, and if such a connection were ever definitively established, the coin's historical importance would increase even further, because it would represent not just an error, but a tangible artifact of experimentation and adaptation within the mint, and collectors prize such artifacts because they reveal hidden chapters of history, and beyond all of this lies the psychological power of the penny itself, because pennies are often dismissed as worthless, inconvenient, and insignificant, and the idea that a penny from 1984 could be worth $12 million is inherently captivating, challenging deeply held assumptions about value and importance, and this shock factor draws attention not only from collectors but from the general public, and attention fuels demand, because people are drawn to objects that defy expectations and tell compelling stories, and in the high-end collectibles market, storytelling is a critical component of value, because collectors are not just buying objects, they are buying narratives, legacy, and identity. And this coin embodies the ultimate narrative of hidden treasure, of mistakes turned into masterpieces, and of chance elevating the ordinary into the extraordinary, and when experts discuss a $12 million valuation for this 1984 D cent, they are not suggesting that such a price is guaranteed or intrinsic, but rather that under the right circumstances, with the right buyers, such a valuation is possible, because value at this level is determined by desire, competition,